Berlin, January 1944. A low ceiling of gray clouds presses over the capital as if the sky itself is sinking under the weight of the war. Inside a small, dimly lit signals intelligence bunker beneath Tempelhof Airport, a German intercept operator named Wilhelm Hartmann adjusts the dials of a crackling receiver, searching through the endless static for signs of American radio chatter. The room hums with the oppressive quiet of men who haven't slept enough to dream anymore. Then, without warning, a voice, clearer than anything he's heard in weeks, cuts through the noise. It's American. Calm. Almost casual. And the words he hears make his hand freeze above the notepad. He calls for his supervisor, who rushes in expecting routine traffic. But as soon as he hears the transmission himself, his posture stiffens. The operator rewinds the magnetic spool and plays it again. This time, others gather around the speaker. The American officer's voice is steady, almost conversational. He says, "Replace the losses and prepare for the next group. Fresh aircraft arrive tomorrow." And then the transmission ends as abruptly as it began, swallowed by static and the cold hum of the bunker lights. No one speaks. Because everyone in the room knows what those words mean. Not just aircraft replaced. Not just losses absorbed. The Americans are treating tonight's casualties, hundreds of planes, perhaps, as routine. Replace the losses. As if building aircraft were like producing typewriters or bicycles. As if 20 bombers destroyed today simply meant 25 new ones built tomorrow. One of the younger operators mutters, "Impossible." But his supervisor shakes his head, pale and silent, because he knows it isn't impossible. It's happening. And this one intercepted message has just revealed the truth Germany has been trying desperately to deny. America is fighting a different war. A war Germany cannot sustain. In the hours that follow, the room becomes an island of frantic calculation. Officers pull charts off shelves, run numbers on scrap paper, compare American factory reports with what the Luftwaffe has observed in the skies. They had assumed American industry was large, yes, but not limitless. They had believed that each bomber shot down was a small step toward tipping the balance. Now, suddenly, the ground shifts beneath them. If the Americans can simply replace the losses, then the very foundation of Germany's strategy, attrition, collapses instantly. One colonel leans against the wall, exhaling sharply, staring at the radio like it has betrayed him. Another officer, usually unshakable, whispers, "How many factories do they have?" And no one can answer. Not with certainty. They've seen the reconnaissance photos. They've read the reports. But hearing an American officer speak with such casual confidence, "Tomorrow we replace them," is different. It's intimate. Unfiltered. It strips away the propaganda, the myths, the excuses. Outside the bunker, Berliners go about their day unaware that a single transmission beneath their feet has just shaken the Luftwaffe's final illusions. A thin snow falls over the city, settling over piles of rubble that once were houses, shops, and schools. People stand in breadlines, stamping their feet for warmth. Children carry buckets of coal dust to heat their homes. Soldiers on leave walk through the streets with hollow eyes. The war is stretching, tightening, draining the country bit by bit. Yet the regime keeps insisting victory is inevitable, that new weapons will soon turn the tide. But down in Tempelhof, that lie is already unraveling. As night falls, the officer in charge sends a messenger to deliver the transcript to the Air Ministry. The young runner races through the underground corridors, boots echoing. He doesn't read the message, he doesn't need to. He can see the fear in the intercept officers' faces. When he reaches the ministry, the halls buzz with low conversations. Officers from different branches exchange glances filled with an unspoken acknowledgement. Something is changing. Slowly, the transcript circulates through the upper ranks. Some laugh nervously, insisting the Americans must be exaggerating. Others fall silent, lost in thought, their eyes drifting toward maps showing the skies thick with Allied aircraft. For months, the Luftwaffe has struggled to defend the homeland. Fuel shortages, worn engines, pilots dying faster than replacements can be trained. And now, with one American sentence, Germany sees the truth. The enemy is not growing weaker from losses. The enemy is growing stronger. Soon the transcript lands on the desk of General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland, who reads it 3 times. He already knows the state of his fighters. He knows the pilots flying today are less experienced, their planes older, their fuel rationed. He knows the Allied bomber streams have grown from dozens to hundreds to thousands. But this message confirms what he feared privately: the Americans are not scraping reserves. They're entering their peak. And Germany is not rising to meet them. Germany is falling apart. Meanwhile, in a modest apartment in Berlin, a woman named Lena Mahler sets plates on the table for her 2 children. Her husband is serving on the Eastern Front. She listens as the radio plays music meant to raise morale. She hears the announcers speak of courage, sacrifice, destiny. But outside her window, she sees a city dimming, factories burning, people trudging home with ration vouchers. She doesn't know about the intercepted message. She doesn't know that today marks the moment the war quietly shifted from desperate struggle to inevitable decline. But she feels it, like a cold wind slipping through the cracks of her walls. Back in Tempelhof, Wilhelm Hartmann cannot sleep. He returns to the radio room long after his shift has ended. He sits before the equipment, headphones around his neck, staring at the dials. He replays the message one more time. Replace the losses. The phrase haunts him. He imagines American factories glowing through the night, thousands of workers assembling wings, engines, propellers, while German factories lie in ruins. He imagines bomber crews drinking coffee before dawn, climbing into newly built aircraft identical to the ones the Luftwaffe just shot down. He imagines a country across the ocean whose industrial heartbeat is only now beginning to thrum at full strength. For the first time since the war began, Wilhelm feels something he hasn't dared to feel before: the war is no longer winnable. And tomorrow, when the next wave of bombers appears over Berlin, that feeling will spread far beyond the bunker walls. Morning scraped its way into Berlin like a dull blade, revealing a city that had aged another decade overnight. Chimneys coughed out thin columns of smoke, streetcars rattled along tracks warped by bomb damage, and the people, thin-faced, hurried, weary, moved through the cold with the numb routine of those who have forgotten how not to endure. But deep below the city, inside the Air Ministry's basement conference room, something colder than winter awaited the officers gathering around a long wooden table. They had all read the transcript. Some carried marked copies beneath their coats. Others held it tightly, as if afraid it might dissolve. They took their seats, and for several moments no one spoke. The silence inside that room felt heavier than the bombs that had fallen the week before. Finally, General Kohler cleared his throat and asked the question everyone feared: is the transmission authentic? The signal's intelligence chief answered quietly, yes. No encryption. No distortion. It was not meant to be hidden. Those words rippled through the room like a tremor. Not meant to be hidden. Not meant to be disguised. The Americans were speaking openly because they weren't afraid of anyone listening. Galland stepped forward, placing a stack of charts on the table. Fuel shortages. Aircraft production collapses. Pilot losses. Each page told a story far more painful than any propaganda could soothe. Our young pilots are dying faster than we can train replacements, he said. We've lost 80% of our veterans. And now, he tapped the transcript, they are telling us they can replace everything we destroy. Another officer muttered, if they can replace the losses, then we cannot bleed them. And if we cannot bleed them? His voice cracked before he finished the sentence. Everyone understood the ending. Without attrition, victory becomes fantasy. Across town, near Alexanderplatz, tens of thousands of Berliners streamed into underground stations as air raid sirens wailed once again. People no longer startled when the sirens screamed. They simply moved, numb, automatic, carrying blankets, buckets, books, whatever brought comfort in the darkness. In one shelter, an old man leaned close to a young Luftwaffe mechanic and whispered, "Will our fighters stop them today?" The mechanic had no answer. He had spent the past week stripping parts from wrecked Messerschmitts just to keep a handful flying. He thought of the intercepted message, which he wasn't supposed to know about but had been whispered among the ground crews. Replace the losses. In the gloom of the shelter, He looked at the old man and said nothing. Above the city, the day's raid approached long before anyone heard it. A faint, low-frequency vibration seeped through the walls and into the bones of the people hiding below. Children covered their ears. Women held trembling hands. And then the sky opened with the unmistakable roar of 4-engine bombers, dozens at first, then hundreds. German flak batteries fired desperately, but the Mustangs were already there, streaking across the sky with the calm confidence of predators that know the hunt is easy. A Luftwaffe squadron scrambled from a nearby airfield, engines coughing in the cold. The pilots had been briefed that the enemy was strong today, but nothing prepared them for the sight above the cloud line, a wall of bombers stretching from horizon to horizon, guarded by fighters at every altitude. Some pilots hesitated. Others dove in with grim resolve. Within minutes, the Mustangs pounced, and the radio channels crackled with clipped cries, warnings, curses, and static. When the surviving aircraft limped back to base, a mechanic counted 7 planes returning from 32. The squadron leader climbed out of his cockpit and sat on the tarmac, helmet in his hands, staring at the distant smoke trails. "We can't break them," he whispered. "They're not supposed to have this many." Meanwhile, at the Air Ministry, Ritter stood with a circle of officers studying fresh reconnaissance photos spread across the table. The images were staggering. American convoys rolling through France like metallic rivers, tanks glinting in the sun, supply depots expanding daily, and airfields packed with newly arrived Mustangs. One photograph showed rows of engines, brand new, untouched, piled like firewood. Another captured an assembly line where aircraft wings moved along rails in perfect formation. And in the corner of one image, an American worker smiled at the camera as if posing for a family portrait. That smile hit Ritter like a blow. The Americans were not exhausted. They were not breaking. They were working, calmly, confidently, relentlessly. One colonel slammed his fist on the table. "How can they afford this?" Galland answered without emotion. "Because they have the fuel. They have steel. They have factories. And they have the people." Another officer muttered bitterly, "And we have none of these." But Ritter shook his head. "It's not that simple. It's their scale. It's their speed. It's their distance from the war." He pointed to a column of numbers. "Their cities are intact. Their ports are open. Their workers are rested. Their land is untouched." A bitter silence followed. The entire German high command now understood that they were fighting a war of annihilation, just not the one they thought. The enemy was not trying to annihilate Germany. The enemy was annihilating the idea that Germany could keep up. By late afternoon, the fires over Berlin had dimmed, leaving ash drifting over the ruins like snowflakes. Ritter walked outside to clear his head, but the city offered no comfort. Buildings stood like skeletons, their windows hollow, their bricks scorched. Women shoveled debris into carts. Children searched rubble for anything salvageable. A wounded soldier limped past, dragging his leg behind him. Ritter watched them all and felt something shift inside him. If the Americans truly could replace the losses, if they truly could keep filling the skies with endless waves of bombers and fighters, then what future remained for these people? For this city? For the Reich they'd been told was destined to endure 1,000 years? As dusk fell again, the operator Wilhelm Hartmann returned to the signals bunker to resume intercept duty. He slid on his headphones, expecting static. Instead, he heard another American transmission, routine, clipped, efficient. This time the officer said, "New aircraft ahead of schedule. Spare crews arriving next week." Hartmann froze. Then he rewound the recording and listened again. Spare crews. Germany could barely keep experienced pilots alive. America was sending spare crews. He looked around the bunker. No one spoke, but every man wore the same expression. Hollow. Quiet. A dawning understanding that a single intercepted transmission had not just revealed American strength, it had revealed German hopelessness. And upstairs, far above the bunker's concrete walls, the sky over Berlin glowed faintly with the reflection of distant fires. Fires that no longer looked like temporary devastation, but like the beginning of an ending. The next morning, a damp fog rolled over Berlin, softening the edges of the city's ruins but doing nothing to soften the dread settling into the minds of those who understood what had happened the night before. For the civilians, nothing seemed different. Just another day of sirens, ration lines, and the distant thunder of artillery far to the east. But inside the upper floors of the Air Ministry, the intercepted American transmission had detonated something far more destructive than a bomb. It destroyed the last illusions of parity. It shattered the belief, carefully nurtured since 1939, that German ingenuity could always compensate for German shortages. For the first time, senior officers found themselves staring not at maps, but at production graphs, shipping totals, steel quotas, oil reserves, and manpower tables. The war, stripped of its heroic mythology, had become math. And math was merciless. Ritter walked into the Situation Room shortly after dawn, carrying the message transcript in his coat pocket like a piece of shrapnel he couldn't remove. A small group of analysts stood around a projector, watching a series of grainy photographs taken by Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft. The first image showed a harbor in New Jersey, Liberty ships lined up in numbers so vast that the wooden piers sagged from their weight. The next image showed a train yard in Ohio, rail lines gleaming beneath rows of flat cars, each one carrying a Sherman tank fresh off the assembly line. Another photo revealed a warehouse holding nothing but aircraft engines, stacked to the rafters like crates of wine. Ritter stared at that image for a long moment. "We build a handful each week," one officer murmured beside him. "They build dozens before lunch." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room understood that numbers like these didn't just win battles, they overpowered entire strategies. Germany, stretched across two fronts, living off dwindling coal reserves and synthetic fuel plants already bombed into scrap, could not match an enemy whose strength was measured not in battalions but in millions of horsepower. The American war machine didn't sleep. It didn't tire. It didn't ration. It grew. Constantly. Unstoppably. A message arrived from the Western Front, another frontline report that read like a confession. American forces were rotating fresh divisions into the line while removing exhausted units for rest and reorganization. The Wehrmacht officers who read it lowered their eyes. Germany had no reserves left. No rest cycles. No replacements. Units that had fought since Normandy were now held together by desperation, not doctrine. In some divisions, teenagers carried rifles older than they were. In others, wounded men returned to the battlefield because they had no choice. Another dispatch came in. American engineers had constructed an entire forward airstrip in a single night. Fuel depots sprang up around it like mushrooms after rain. Within hours, Mustangs were taking off again, engines polished and gleaming, pilots rested and smiling. A German reconnaissance pilot managed to photograph the field from altitude and returned pale and speechless. "They build faster than we can destroy," he said. His commander corrected him gently. "No. They build faster than we can react." Across the city, Berliners filed through ration centers, unaware that their leaders had begun quietly discussing long-prohibited topics, shortages that could not be fixed, fuel stocks that would not last the month, defenses that would collapse before spring. Inside one quiet office, an economist explained the situation to a colonel using simple objects on a desk: a pencil for American oil production, a paperclip for German oil, an ashtray for Allied shipping, and a matchbox for the Luftwaffe's remaining aircraft. When he finished arranging them, the colonel stared at the table for a long time, then muttered, "It's not a war anymore. It's a race we already lost." Meanwhile, far below the city, Wilhelm Hartmann sat again at his radio station. He had barely slept. His mind kept replaying the American voice, calm, steady, confident. Replace the losses. He wondered what the man looked like. Did he have any idea the effect his words had on the enemy? Or was he simply doing his job, unaware he had just shattered the last shield of a nation months from collapse? Wilhelm tuned the receiver slowly, listening through the static as faint signals drifted by. British chatter. Morse code. Then silence. He adjusted the dial again. Suddenly, another American voice. This one is younger, almost cheerful. New engines arriving at base. Spare Mustangs scheduled for delivery soon. Wilhelm swallowed hard. Spare Mustangs. The Luftwaffe had fought tooth and nail to keep a single squadron operational. America had spares. The realization struck him like cold water. Germany wasn't fighting an enemy, it was fighting a production line. At the same hour, a meeting was convened inside the Reich Chancellery. Hitler sat at the head of the table, eyes bloodshot, fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of his chair as generals presented the Intercept transcript alongside the latest production estimates. He read the message slowly. Replace the losses. Prepare for the next group. Fresh aircraft arriving tomorrow. His jaw tightened. American bluster, he said, waving the papers aside. But no one in the room echoed him. The silence was heavy. Dangerous. 4 months now, these men had offered optimistic forecasts, assurances of new weapons, promises of regained momentum. But the transmission had ripped through the illusions like shrapnel through glass. They could no longer pretend. One general finally spoke, voice strained. Mein Führer, if the United States truly possesses this capacity, then attrition is not a strategy. It is suicide. Hitler glared at him, but the officer did not withdraw the statement. There was no point. The truth had escaped into the room like gas, impossible to contain. Outside, far beyond Berlin's armored windows, American bombers crossed the sky again, fewer than yesterday, but enough to remind the city that the rhythm of destruction would not slow. Children flinched at the distant rumble. Mothers hugged them tighter. And somewhere in the streets, Ritter passed a store window covered in frost and ash. His reflection looked older than he remembered. He had believed in victory once, fervently, unquestioningly. Now he felt something more unsettling, clarity. The war had transformed into an equation. And Germany no longer had the numbers to solve it. As he walked, the same thought echoed in his mind, growing louder with every step. That single intercepted message was not an error, not a boast, not a slip. It was a window, a glimpse into the machinery of a giant. And once a man sees a giant clearly, he cannot convince himself it is a shadow. And in that moment Ritter understood. Germany didn't lose the war when its armies faltered. Germany lost the war the moment it finally heard how effortlessly the Americans intended to win. By early evening, Berlin's streets were bathed in a yellow haze of smoke and winter dusk, and the city's pulse had slowed to a kind of exhausted heartbeat. Each hour seemed heavier than the last. Yet inside the higher echelons of the Luftwaffe command building, events were accelerating, faster, sharper, more brutally honest than at any other point in the war. Ritter arrived for a late briefing, invited not because of rank but because he was among the few who had heard the original intercepted message firsthand. As he entered the room, the sense of dread was unmistakable. Maps covered the walls, but unlike earlier in the war, when arrows had represented daring thrusts, sweeping advances, and confident offensives, these maps now showed retreat upon retreat. Thin black lines stretched across Germany like fault lines, and the red arrows pressed in from every direction. Yet even the front lines, as critical as they were, had taken a back seat to something catastrophic unfolding behind them. A senior logistics officer stood at the front and began outlining the newest figures. His voice shook, though he tried to hide it. American monthly aircraft production had surpassed Germany's annual output. Tank production, the same. Shipbuilding, beyond all measurable comparison. We cannot contest these numbers, he said, sliding a stack of papers across the table. Not with our resources. Not with our fuel. Not with our factories. He hesitated, then added, not anymore. The room fell silent, but it wasn't the silence of shock, it was the silence of acknowledgement. 4 months, the officers had privately suspected this truth. The intercepted message had simply forced them to face it. The officer then switched on a projector and revealed reconnaissance footage taken over an American airfield in England just hours before. As the film flickered on the wall, the Germans watched row after row of Mustangs taxiing into formation, their polished bodies gleaming even in black and white light. Behind them stood endless lines of spare engines, fuel trucks, mechanics, More personnel on one airfield than some Luftwaffe divisions had left across the entire front. A squadron commander whispered, "Look how many." His colleague replied bleakly, "Those are the ones we can see." No one dared to imagine how many existed beyond the camera's view. One major stepped forward and addressed the room. "Gentlemen, the Americans are not simply replacing aircraft. They are expanding faster than we can shoot them down." He pointed at the glowing screen. "Every plane we destroy is replaced by 2. Every pilot we kill is replaced by 3. This is why the transmission mattered. It confirmed the scale. It confirmed the speed. It confirmed that the skies no longer belong to us." He paused, the weight of his own words settling painfully into the air. "It confirmed that our strategy ended last night." But it wasn't just the military leadership crumbling under the revelation. Across Berlin that evening, civilians sensed a kind of invisible shift. Not from propaganda broadcasts, not from government announcements, but from the expressions of soldiers returning from the front. A young infantryman limped through Friedrichstrasse, still in his mud-caked uniform. When a shopkeeper asked what the situation was in the West, the soldier simply shook his head and replied, "The Americans don't fight like we thought. They don't stop. They don't weaken. They grow." His voice cracked as he added, "And they're not afraid. Why would they be? They have everything." That last word, everything, spread from person to person like a ghost story whispered in air raid shelters. In one basement shelter, a mother named Marta comforted her 2 children as distant bombs rattled the ceiling. Her neighbor whispered rumors she had heard, that America had new fleets crossing the Atlantic, that their factories were producing engines faster than Germany could refine fuel, that entire shipyards worked without pause even on Sundays. Marta didn't know if any of it was true. But she knew the men in uniform looked more hollow every day. She knew the bombings grew louder. And she had begun to understand that whatever victory the government promised had turned into something abstract and unreachable. Meanwhile, back in the command building, another critical report arrived from a field marshal on the Western Front. The message was brief, almost brutally so: "Enemy divisions remain fresh. Ours cannot hold without fuel. Request directives." But the most chilling part came after a pause, an admission that the field marshal would never have written just months earlier. "This war is no longer determined by tactics. It is determined by resources." The officers exchanged glances. It was the first time such a statement had been put into writing by a commander of his rank. The intercepted American transmission had not only exposed the imbalance, it had forced Germany's top leaders to articulate the truth openly. Late that night, as Ritter walked through the ministry's darkened hallways, he overheard 2 junior staff officers speaking in hushed tones near a stairwell. One said, "Do you think the Führer knows?" The other replied, "He knows. He just won't believe it." They fell silent when Ritter approached, but the question lingered in his mind. What would it mean if Hitler understood the truth but refused to accept it? What kind of decisions would such denial produce? Ritter shivered. The thought was almost more terrifying than the truth itself. Returning to the signals bunker, Ritter checked in on Wilhelm Hartmann. The young operator sat hunched over his console, headphones on, eyes fixed on the panel of blinking lights. He didn't look up when Ritter approached. He simply said, "I've been waiting to hear it again." Ritter placed a hand on his shoulder. "It doesn't matter if we hear another message," he said softly. "We already know." Hartmann removed his headphones and stared at the floor. "What happens now?" he asked. Ritter paused, searching for an answer he didn't have, before finally saying, "Now we witness the consequences." At that exact moment, far above them, another formation of American bombers crossed the night sky, moving with the calm confidence of machines backed by an empire of industry. German spotters tracked the formation and sent in reports, but even they spoke with a strange resignation. One wrote, "They fly like they are certain the sky belongs to them." Another observed, "We shoot, but they do not flinch." And as the Americans vanished into the darkness, Ritter realized something he had been resisting. The intercepted message had not been the cause of Germany's collapse. It had merely revealed the collapse already in motion. A single sentence had opened the curtain and shown the reality behind it, the colossal machinery of a nation that had finally awakened and was now rolling forward with unstoppable force. A force Germany could neither match nor outrun. By the next morning, Berlin awoke beneath a heavy, unmoving silence, the kind that settles over a city not after a battle, but after a realization. Not a single bomb had fallen overnight, yet the atmosphere felt more suffocating than during the loudest raid. The streets were cold, colorless, and almost brittle. People moved slowly, muttering to one another in voices too tired to hope, too frightened to despair. The war had not ended, but something within the war had. A thread had snapped. A belief had withered. And all of it began with one line broadcast over American frequencies, one sentence that had spiraled through the German state like a shockwave. Inside the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's staff prepared for another briefing, though no one called it that anymore. It felt less like planning and more like waiting, waiting for the next blow, the next city to fall, the next factory to flatten, the next truth to break through Hitler's stubborn illusions. Ritter stood among the officers as the meeting began. Charts were presented. Losses recited. Production figures compared. But no one leaned forward eagerly. No one interrupted. No one argued. The intercepted message had done something no Allied offensive had achieved. It had silenced Germany's confidence. A senior Luftwaffe officer placed the transcript on the table almost ceremonially. Replace the losses. Prepare for the next group. Fresh aircraft arriving tomorrow. Hitler glanced at it briefly, then looked away as if the words were toxic. Their factories cannot sustain this forever, he insisted. No economy can. They will collapse. They must collapse. But this time, his generals did not nod. They exchanged looks, heavy, resigned, unspoken. They had seen the reconnaissance footage. They had seen the new divisions forming in the west. They had seen the skies fill with an air force that seemed to regenerate every sunrise. Collapse was not happening on the other side of the ocean. Collapse was happening here. In the bunkers beneath Tempelhof, Wilhelm Hartmann continued his intercept shift, headphones pressed tightly against his ears. The static swirled like winter wind. 4 hours, nothing came. Then, a faint voice again, the Americans, speaking in clipped, efficient tones. This time the message was shorter, shipment ahead of schedule. Fuel reserves secured. Rotation complete. Wilhelm felt his chest tense. This was no boast. This was the quiet, steady rhythm of a nation operating at full force. He wrote down the words mechanically, but his mind drifted. Fuel reserves secured. Germany had none. Rotation complete. Germany had no rested divisions to rotate. Ahead of schedule. Germany had not been ahead of schedule since 1941. Upstairs, Ritter walked out into the courtyard for air. Snow drifted lightly across the cracked stone as he stared up at the washed-out sky. For months, he had believed that if Germany could endure a little longer, just a little longer, something might shift. Something might break in the Allied offensive. Perhaps the Americans would tire. Perhaps their people would demand an end to the war. Perhaps their factories would slow. But now, after hearing the transmission and witnessing the reaction inside the command rooms, Ritter felt all those thoughts dissolve. The Americans were not tiring. They were accelerating. A staff runner approached him urgently, handing over the latest frontline report. Ritter read it slowly, words settling like ash. American armored divisions had advanced again, faster than predicted. Their tanks were well fueled, their supply lines uninterrupted, their infantry well fed and well equipped. The report ended with the bleakest line Ritter had read yet. Enemy forces remain at full operational strength. Ours do not. He folded the paper, hands trembling slightly. Elsewhere in Berlin, rumors flew through the air like sparks. People whispered that America had endless steel, endless oil, endless pilots, endless everything. Some dismissed the rumors, insisting Germany still had secret weapons left to unveil. But most saw the truth reflected in the hollow eyes of soldiers returning from the front. Berliners stood in breadlines exchanging quiet questions that no one dared answer. How much longer? Is the army collapsing? Will the Americans reach the capital? But above all, are we already defeated? The answer, though unspoken, was slowly becoming unavoidable. That evening, as Ritter returned to his office, he found Hartmann waiting for him, the message pad clutched tightly in his hand. Another one, Hartmann said quietly. Ritter read the American words. Not taunting. Not emotional. Just logistics, pure, efficient, overwhelming. And that's what made them terrifying. America was not fighting Germany emotionally. America was not fighting Germany ideologically. America was fighting Germany materially. And materials had no fear, no fatigue, no uncertainty. As Ritter sat down, he noticed a detail that unsettled him even more. The Americans did not speak like men engaged in a desperate war. Their tone suggested something else entirely: momentum, control, capacity. The calm voice of a nation not merely participating in the conflict, but owning the outcome. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. Then he closed his eyes, imagining the factories across the Atlantic, massive, roaring, alive. Assembly lines glowing through the night. Workers changing shifts as steadily as tides. Engines tested with thunderous roars. Tank treads rolling off platforms. Ammunition packed into crates taller than men. Ships sliding into the water every 24 hours. Aircraft painted, fueled, tested, flown. And all of it destined for the sky over Germany. One message had revealed that reality. But it wasn't the message itself that broke German morale, it was the quiet, devastating understanding it carried. The Americans could do this forever. Germany could not. Late that night, Berlin's lights flickered and died, plunging the city into near-total darkness. The only glow came from fires smoldering in the distance and the occasional sweep of searchlights across the horizon. Ritter stepped out into the cold and looked up. Somewhere out there, beyond the smoke and the clouds, American bombers were preparing for another sortie. Pilots tightened their gloves. Engines warmed. Mustangs lined up like silent silver predators. And in the darkness beneath Berlin, a single sentence echoed in Ritter's mind: replace the losses. Prepare for the next group. With those words, the war's outcome had crystallized, not when Germany's armies were defeated, not when its cities fell, but when its leaders finally understood what they were truly fighting. Not a nation. Not an army. Not even a strategy. A machine. A machine vast enough to smother an empire. And with that understanding, Germany's belief in victory did not just falter, it died.